crustal earthquakes. So thanks to the many colleagues who've worked with me on this topic over the years. To start off with, if I can change it, yeah, we'll start at the beginning, I guess. So the framework within which this kind of topic is set is really thinking about the crustal strength profile. So we have these end-member models, of course, where we might have a weak lower crust, or we might have a strong lower crust, or probably something in between. And that's a reflection of the switch from frictional to viscous deformation as we get deeper within the crust. And that's also reflected at a slightly smaller scale, perhaps, at how we think about a fault or a shear zone as it gets deeper within the earth, and the kind of deformation mechanisms that we expect. So these are obviously widely applicable kind of textbook style models, which are often used, but I think we should remember that at any depth within the Earth's crust, we could technically have a switch between frictional and viscous deformation mechanisms given the right conditions. So usually maybe a change in strain rate, or perhaps in rheology. And it's this kind of wider field of mixed kind of viscous and frictional deformation in which the study, I would say, of lower crustal earthquakes is really set, because it's just the fact that we are getting frictional deformation in a region below the seismogenic zone, so in a region where we would typically expect viscous deformation to predominate. So the geological record is quite valuable here, because exhumed fault and shear zones can give us a real nice idea of the geometry and the changing deformation mechanisms that are associated with deformation in the lower crust. And predominantly this takes place looking at seismic fault rocks, often pseudotachylyte, so frictional melts produced during seismic slip. And there are some really nice examples that come from around the world. And actually this database from Sibson and Toy is actually a bit out of date, but it does illustrate that. There are some nice examples from Australia on the Woodruff rust, from Norway in the Western Gneisses and the Bergen Arcs, and some others that have been more recently worked on in Canada, in Italy, and in other places in Norway that really illustrate some of the deformation characteristics of the lower continental crust. So some of the questions which come up when we think about how do we actually get earthquakes within the lower continental crust, when we might expect viscous shear to predominate. So we could say quite basically that we need quite a strong crust, but even so, we still need to somehow get the stresses high enough to reach the failure stress of that strong crust at high lithostatic pressures. So how might we do that? What kind of rheological context, lithological context, tectonic conditions would actually favour a seismogenic lower crust? So that's an important question if we're trying to link our findings from the ancient geological record to present day tectonic context. Where would we maybe expect the lower crust to be seismogenic? If we have a mix of viscous and frictional deformation, how do those interplay, and do they actually help the crust evolve rheologically over time? If there are fluids in the equation, how do they feed into that relationship? And what is the typical energy budget of lower crustal earthquakes? If we have some different deformation mechanisms at play, does this change, for example, scaling relationships compared to shallower earthquakes? And there are many more questions. These are literally the first 5 that I thought of. And they're all being worked on actually by some recent research. So it's quite an exciting field to be in. I mostly look or have looked recently at that stress state. So how do we actually get the stresses high enough to reach the failure strength of strong rocks deep in the lower crust? And obviously this is a question which has preoccupied people for quite a while. And there are 3 main themes which I've picked out here as to how we might actually do that. So firstly, if we actually have a seismogenically active upper crust, so there are earthquakes occurring in the upper crust, we might actually end up loading transiently the lower crust, the frictional viscous transition and beyond, by having earthquake slip occurring in the upper crust. And that can promote some quite high perturbations, particularly around that frictional viscous transition zone. On a much smaller scale, perhaps even on the grain scale, if we are having certain reactions with volume changes and also fluids, which I haven't included here but should have, we can also get stress concentrations on a very small scale, which can lead to fracturing and brittle behaviour deep in the lower crust. Often this work is more sort of focused on subducting oceanic crust, but it can still apply in certain situations to the continental crust. And then finally, in a kind of broad brush, I've just called this stress concentrations based on rheological heterogeneity. So this might be changes in rock type with very different strengths across a kind of regional scale shear zone. And there's been a nice study on that recently by Orlandini and Menegon from 2020, where they looked at a shear zone in Canada and noted that their pseudotachylites were really occurring at particular lithological boundaries where they think the strain rate and stresses have been perturbed by different rheologies. But it might also be linked to localized strain and the geometry of that shear zone. Okay, so the case study that I'm going to show to you is based in the Lofoten Islands of northwestern Norway. And this is an archipelago which nicely exposes the crust of Baltica. So unlike mainland Norway, there isn't much covered by the Caledonian nappes, and instead we get this deep lower crust exposed. And there's a huge range of structural features that people have looked at over the years, and these range from sort of large-scale faults and shear zones, like the Eidfjord shear zone, which is shown in that landscape picture. And this is a big detachment fault from the Lake Devonian, which has pseudotachylites that are proposed to have formed at about 35 kilometers, so really deep seismicity on a large structure. But for the most part, we get the kind of full range of scales, so down to the centimeter scale, faults and shear zones that are tens of centimeters or meters or hundreds of meters long. So there's a big range of scales to work with, and these kind of occurrences also range from really nice pristine pseudotachylites that really record really well a single earthquake, a single slip, they're not reactivated, to pseudotachylites that are occurring spatially associated with shear zones, and also pseudotachylites that have been overprinted by shear zones. So there's a real mix of frictional and viscous behavior to look at. So one of the islands where a lot of work has been done, including my own, is this island of Flakstadøy. And just to give you a little flavour of the lithology, there's lots of anorthosite, gabbros, and related kind of mafic rocks of various flavours, but also some paranizes as well. So looking at Flakstadøy and the study area where I've done most of my research with my colleagues is really in the anorthosite, and there's a lovely kind of ridge of anorthosite in the southeast of the island near to the fishing village of Nysfjord. And as you can see in the aerial photo here in the center, one of the great things is the amount of exposure is really amazing, and even from the aerial photo you've probably picked out the kind of fractures that are running through, and these are picking out in turn older shear zones. So the shear zones are really occurring in three main orientations. Though actually you can see that they're coeval when you're in the field, so they're all actually active at the same time, but they're all highly localized. So these are features which aren't very wide. There are a few exceptions, but many of them aren't really much wider than sort of 20 or 30 centimeters or much narrower indeed. And the geometry is quite striking. So because of that localized nature, the anorthosite in between is rich in plagioclase, of course, some pyroxene, some olivine, some garnets, but it's very, very strong and not really given to viscous strain unless there is some kind of precursor. And that's really why we think that these shear zones take these very systematic orientations, because they're actually picking out and exploiting pre-existing pseudotachyllite faults, but also perhaps dikes as well. So there's a very blocky geometry with these shear zones bounding these blocks of anorthosite which don't have much apparent viscous strain within them. When we look at these blocks, so they're bounded by these shear zones at scales of sort of, well, up to about 100 meters, but down to kind of, well, even about 10 centimeters between adjacent shear zones. Some of these blocks are actually cut by pseudotachyllite faults. And so the pseudotachylites I've mentioned, which are magnetized and now formed shear zones, are very interesting in themselves, but all the information they really held about their seismic source has really been overprinted by the viscous deformation. So I'm not going to talk about those here, although we have done some work on them. The ones that are interesting to us at the moment are these ones cutting across the blocks between the shear zones. And these are still, for the most part, kind of pristine, so they've not been overprinted or reactivated. They offset passive markers, so we know they're shear faults, and they very distinctively cut from one shear zone to another. So they don't actually cross the shear zones and are not cross-cut by the shear zones. But in some cases, we have some nice observations where we can see that these pseudotachylyte veins are actually dragged into the viscous shear zones themselves. So the idea we have actually is that the pseudotachylites were forming basically coevally with the shear zones. So we've got frictional slip occurring at the same time as the viscous creep of the shear zones as a whole. So the model really is that as the shear zone, the regional shear zone is active and all those shear zone strands are viscously creeping at various rates, the internal blocks between them remain strong, but we're going to get a heterogeneous stress field in these blocks, and stress is going to accumulate at certain points based on the variable geometry of those intersecting shear zones and creep rates and so on. But locally, we're going to be able to amplify those stresses to the failure strength, essentially, of the anorthosite block. And when we do that, we're going to rupture the block, the stress is released, and the viscous creep carries on. So both the viscous and the frictional processes are contributing towards the overall behavior and accommodation of strain within the shear zone. So the other bit of work that we were able to do from that field observation is really to look at the length and the thickness of melt along these faults. So on a very small scale, but these are really nice to measure because you can see really from one end to the other. And when we did some kind of approximate calculations as to roughly what magnitude and what kind of stress drops we would get, this is shown on the graph in the black and the white circles for different fault geometries, but the stress drops which are coming out of these kind of approximations were pretty high. So about the gigapascal magnitude, and that's much, much higher than most seismic events in the upper crust, for example, will be proposed to have. So that's very approximate, but it was interesting. And we were kind of thinking, okay, how can we actually maybe constrain that a bit better? So we turned to the microstructures. And again, we're looking at these faults with pseudotachylyte along them, cutting across these small scale blocks from one shear zone to another. And what we were looking for is, are there any particular microstructures that are spatially associated with the pseudotachylyte fault, so that we could infer that perhaps they are related very much to the seismicity. And if we were lucky, we were kind of hoping for a kind of time sequence as well of microstructures. So we picked up pyroxenes from the anorthosite to look at particularly, and we looked at some samples that were taken away from the pseudotachylyte faults, and we looked at some thin sections like you can see here, which cover the pseudotachylyte-bearing fault. And we looked at pyroxenes in the wall rock, right up close on the margins of the pseudotachylyte fault, and also those which are contained as clasts within the pseudotachylyte vein. So we inferred that they were sort of part of the fault zone at some point. Just to give you a flavor of some of the microstructures that we found. So this is an EBSD map, a phase map on the left, and a map of grain orientation spread on the right, which show typical microstructures of clinoproxian and host rock. And typically it's mostly twinning. There's not too much else going on, to be honest. And that twinning we can see in thin sections which have a fault in them, a pseudotachylyte fault, but we don't see the twinning so much in samples that were taken away from the pseudotachylyte faults. So already we think there's some kind of spatial association there with twinning. When we look at clasts within the fault zone, we can see that those twins and also the orthopyroxene lamellae where present have been deformed themselves, so they're cut by various angle boundaries, and also the grains actually are bent themselves. So there's quite a lot going on there. But actually what's interesting is that we see, and I don't know how clear that is actually in the lower map, but this is showing the difference in orientation away from the reference point in the red. And if you look at the profile, which is taken from that profile A to A prime, what we're seeing here is this quite small wavelength undulations of the crystal lattice. And we see that in several of the clasts, and it's attributable to low temperature plasticity. So that's something which is very much only found in the class, so within the pseudotachylyte vein itself. Orthopyroxenes show quite distinctively different microstructures. So this is a backscattered electron image of a pyroxene, orthopyroxene, in the right next to the pseudotachylyte vein, which I've given a red overlay just to make that clear. So the overprinting grain generally in the mid-grey, if we look at the blue rectangle kind of pop out in the bottom right, has lots of linear fractures and some fragmentation along those. But what's really striking in some regions in the middle of the grain, but always sort of adjacent to the pseudotachylyte vein, is these pervasively fragmented areas like shown in the orange rectangle. So the grain size here is really reduced to sort of a micron or less, so it's very, very striking. There's some evidence of grain growth where we have triple junctions and some sort of preferred growth orientation close to the vein, but there's not much evidence of shear between these fragments, and so it kind of brings to mind the pulverization type process. And this has been kind of linked in other studies looking at lower crustal pseudotachylites. They've also seen similar fragmentation in other minerals as well. We do see that low temperature plasticity in overprinting in clasts again, but actually, interestingly, in the clast, we don't often see that sort of pervasive fragmentation, but we do see fractures that overprint that low temperature plasticity. So that's a good overprinting relationship. And tied together, what we see is that twinning spatially associated with the pseudotachylyte veins, at least within the thin sections. We see low temperature plasticity in both the types of pyroxene where the fault zone eventually forms, and we see that fragmentation overprinting the low temperature plasticity. And that's important because the fragmentation is, if it is a pulverization style formation, we actually would link that to the passage of the rupture tip. And that means that the earlier microstructures therefore precede that and yet are still linked relatively closely spatially to the fault. So perhaps the low temperature plasticity is actually reflecting that localized loading which precedes the actual passage of the rupture. But low temperature plasticity in clinopyroxene, if we're going to elevate the strain rate above a kind of background strain rate, does need quite high differential stresses around the gigapascal scale. So that's actually supporting what we thought from the field and ties in quite nicely with some other recent studies from different depths in the crust, but also looking at microstructures linked to seismic faults, which show that we're having quite major transient stress increases before the rupture actually passes. So these microstructural studies are all tying in nicely to kind of expand our ideas about the different processes occurring during faulting. So as well as the kind of around the process zone, we've got what happens to the damage zone during slip as well. And all of this is important if we're to consider what the actual energy budget of the overall earthquake is. So a good question would be, is this a good example that we can apply worldwide to the lower crust? And I suppose the main differences coming out of studies looking at lower crustal earthquakes from the geological record is really the fluid content. So on one extreme, we've got some really dry examples. Parts of Lofoten are like this, but also the Woodruff Rust in Australia. And what those are characterized by are really localized viscous shear zones and plenty of pseudotachylites. So lots of frictional slip, and there's likely to be a strong geometrical effect, therefore, a bit like we see in Nysfjord on sort of actually sort of localizing in situ stresses to quite a high effect. On the other hand, in the Bergen Arcs, there's been some great work which looks at how faults, pseudotachylites are actually hydrated. They have hydrated assemblages and appear to be pathways for fluids if there is a fluid source. And as we increase the fluid content of the lower crust, we get hydration reactions which are weakening. And if that is to progress, then in actual fact, we can weaken the lower crust to quite a high extent and have viscous deformation mechanisms becoming much more important. In fact, this might be, if there is a fluid source around, actually a progression through time if seismic activity is to progress. So that was the question that I kind of set out to try and answer, at least in one case. And I've just put the same questions that I had up near the start back up. I think probably touched on all of these a little bit. So they're all very much related. And as I said, there are plenty more, and hopefully if you've got any, I'm very happy to discuss that in the next few minutes.
Thank you. Clap, clap, clap. Sorry about that. Thank you for that presentation. Very interesting. Are there any questions? I'm sure there will be.